Committee will come to order. Good afternoon. I'm Chairman of the Asia and Pacific Subcommittee, and I'd like to yield my time at this time to the Chairman of the full committee, Ed Royce of California.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I want to welcome our witnesses. I think my good friend Steve Shabbat has done a lot of work over the years, and holding this important and timely hearing is part of that effort to make certain that we see some justice done for people who have been through things which are unimaginable for us here. I want to take the opportunity to welcome Ms. Mini Zhou to the Foreign Affairs Committee and to thank her for bravely sharing her story. And I want to also share, as Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, that it's my commitment to all the people who continue to suffer in North Korea that this committee will do all it can to hold Kim Jong-un and his generals accountable for crimes against humanity. Today, I'm announcing that the committee plans to consider bipartisan sanctions legislation against North Korea, which I authored, in May of this year. My legislation targets the regime where it is most vulnerable, in the pocketbook, and it will prevent Kim Jong-un from assessing or accessing, having the ability to use that hard currency that he needs in order to pay his generals. H.R. 1771 now has over 130 co-sponsors, and it will go a long way towards bankrupting the regime in North Korea. It is important that we wake up to the reality that North Korea is not interested in reform. Frankly, that's not, denuclearization does not drive their calculus. And thus, I urge the administration to work with this committee so that the people of North Korea can finally have an opportunity to live without fear, to have an existence without abuse. And I've long been involved in shining the spotlight on the horrific human rights abuses in North Korea. I've had many, many trips to that part of the world and spoken with so many defectors about their particular circumstances. I've had people show me the scars on their bodies from when they were tortured in North Korea. I co-chair the International Parliamentarians Coalition for North Korean Refugees and Human Rights. And I can say that the Committee of Inquiry report on North Korea offers one of the most comprehensive accountings of human rights abuses in that country. Despite the international community's focus on North Korea's weapons program over the past 20 years, too little attention is paid to the question of human rights, the lack of human rights in the country. And this report has finally changed the way the world views North Korea, and I'm hopeful that with this new awareness, action is not far behind. Last month, I led a bipartisan delegation to Seoul. I've been there many times, but this is the second time in some 12 months, in order to reaffirm our nation's special alliance with South Korea. In my meetings with President Park, she has always stressed the importance of fighting, struggling for human rights for the people of North Korea. She said it last year, and she said it again this year to us. As a longtime friend of the Korean people, I know that this issue is very important to South Koreans and Korean Americans alike. And that's why I'm committed to passing this legislation into law, and also because I've looked into the eyes of those who have survived in North Korea, and I want to make certain that that type of horrific thing does not continue to occur. Fighting for human rights is one of the most important tasks that we have as a nation, and that we have here as members of this committee. When we see grave abuses occurring, it is our duty to stand up and take action. Chairman Shabbat, thank you for your leadership on this issue, and I look forward to hearing the testimonies of this distinguished panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the chair announces that we have a series of votes on the floor. The buzzers that you heard going off was us being called over the floor to vote. So we're going to go over and vote right now, and then we'll come back and finish opening statements, and then we'll hear from the panel and have time for questions and that sort of thing. So we apologize for any inconvenience, but we have to head over and vote. We'll be back in a short period of time. Committee's in recess.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Good afternoon. The committee will come back to order. I'd like to welcome everyone to this afternoon's Asia-Pacific Subcommittee hearing on the shocking truth about North Korean tyranny. I want to thank my colleague from California, Mr. Ami Bera, for serving as today's ranking member, and also thank our distinguished witnesses for being here as well. We're especially extremely grateful, Ms. Grace Joe, as the chairman mentioned before, that you could join us here this afternoon. Your perspective will be invaluable for everyone to hear today. I'll make my formal introductions of all the witnesses after I've concluded and the ranking member's concluded his opening statements here this afternoon. We've already heard from the full committee chairman, Mr. Royce, previously, but then we had to go into recess because of votes. And we won't have any votes for another hour and a half or so, I don't think, so hopefully we can get through the rest of the hearing before we have votes again. For 60 years, North Korea has been ruled by one of the most repressive, totalitarian regimes on earth. Millions of North Koreans have been starved to death and sent to concentration camps to die in inhumane ways not seen since the days of Hitler or Stalin. The extent of human rights abuses, a list too long to go into great detail, are deliberate and calculated actions utilized by the Kim regime to quell dissent and maintain ultimate control, just as his father and grandfather did before him. In February, the United Nations Commission of Inquiry released its report on human rights in North Korea, yielding a compendium of crimes against humanity committed by the North Korean regime. While the totality of this report is certainly shocking, a wake-up call for the international community to take action, the horrors described are not a surprise to the human rights community, which has worked with dozens of individuals who have been lucky enough to escape from the Kim Chamber of Horrors. Yet North Korea remains one of the least understood regimes in a world seemingly focused elsewhere. As discussions at the UN about the Commission of Inquiry report continue throughout this week in Geneva, I would urge the international community to reach a consensus to do more than just condemn by words. The time for willful blindness, for looking the other way from North Korea's abuses, must come to an end. There is a tremendous amount the international community can and must do. Future discussions about North Korea should make human rights a priority right alongside nuclear disarmament. North Korea has consistently represented one of the greatest security challenges for the United States because of its determined pursuit of nuclear weapons and missiles. But the threat North Korea poses to our South Korean ally, its record of human rights abuses, and the dangers that it presents to regional stability make dealing with North Korea that much more difficult. After decades of trying to negotiate, cajole, and pressure North Korea to halt its proliferation and stand by its commitments, we have seen little success. In fact, North Korea seems much more determined today to act irresponsibly than ever before. Since 2009, the U.S. has pursued a reactive policy toward North Korea called strategic patience, which maintains leveled pressure and resolute warnings with a door to renewed discussions partly open. This policy, however, has not slowed North Korea's nuclear program, as illustrated by Pyongyang's decision to restart its Yongbyon reactor and, and has been noted in the recently released UN Panel of Experts report. North Korea continues to develop creative ways to evade UN Security Council prohibitions on trade and economic activities to boost its nuclear and missile programs. It has also done nothing to decrease the extent of human rights violations in North Korea. Clearly, U.S. policy has been ineffective. Since Kim Jong-un's assumed power in December 2011, he has embraced the evil, tyrannical, depraved, corrupt, and vile characteristics of his father and grandfather. Despite only slight stylistic leadership differences, the ultimate goals for North Korea remain the same, and the pursuit of nuclear weapons continues unfettered. Throughout 2012 and 2013, the world witnessed an escalation of warlike rhetoric and dangerously irresponsible actions from the third generation Kim, who wanted nothing more than to show the world his threats were real. And this bellicose behavior continues. During this year's joint U.S.-South Korea military drills, which began in February, North Korea conducted a number of prohibited missile tests. Just this past weekend, North Korea test-fired 46 short-range rockets, bringing the total to 70 over the course of the last month, one of which came within range of a Chinese passenger plane. Pyongyang has claimed these tests as part of its own routine self-defense exercises. The Obama administration appears to have outsourced its North Korean policy to China. But China's policies, too, are failing. The sudden and brutal removal of Zhang Song, tech thought to be close to Beijing, was a blow to China. And now the Kim regime seems to be trying to push China out of its circle of influence. This raises a number of concerns and questions as to how China will act in the coming months as the U.S. urges Beijing to not veto the inevitable Security Council resolution condemning North Korea's human rights record, and to stop evading our sanctions policy by funneling money to support Pyongyang's nuclear and missile production. It's clear that a non-nuclear and compliant North Korea is an unreachable goal if the administration maintains its current policy approach. We cannot become comfortably accustomed to North Korea's possession of nuclear weapons or its systematic torture and killing of its own people. North Korea is a grave threat to the United States and our allies in Asia. Policies pursued by presidents of both parties, with minor variations, have failed. It is time for us to reconsider the policies that haven't worked and reapply those that have. Trading valuable concessions failed once, so let's not buy the same horse twice. I believe it's possible to disarm North Korea involuntarily without the use of force. Legislation was introduced last year to give the President the legal tools to do just that. The UN's report makes it vividly clear that if the world community continues to dawdle, growing numbers of innocent North Koreans will suffer and die in horrific ways. Now is the time to put our resources together and act. I look forward to our witnesses' testimonies this afternoon and discussing options we have to hold the North Korean regime accountable. And I'd at this time like to turn to the ranking member, the acting ranking member of the committee, Ami Bera from California.
Thank you, Chairman Shabbat. And thank you for calling this incredibly important hearing to discuss North Korea's abysmal human rights record and clearly the other serious issues that are taking place as North Korea postures. As we all know and we've talked about in the past, North Koreans are deprived of just the basic fundamental freedoms and universal human rights for decades. North Koreans don't have the freedom of speech. They don't have freedom of movement. They don't have freedom of religion. And they're also subjected to chronic starvation and an abysmal and dismal public health system. Last month, the UN released a disturbing report on the gross human rights violations and oppression of the North Koreans experience under the Kim regime. The UN report details atrocious crimes against humanity that are occurring every day, such as persecution, murder, sexual abuse, and forced abortion. However, the perpetrators of these horrendous crimes remain immune by the North Korean justice system, which is utterly despicable. Unless rampant immunity is addressed and stopped, these egregious violations against humanity will, unfortunately, continue in North Korea. I'm also very concerned with North Koreans' aggressive behavior towards South Korea, its nuclear weapons program, and the security threat it poses to the region. Just last Saturday, as the chairman mentioned, North Korea launched 30 short-range rockets into open waters to demonstrate its discontent with ongoing U.S.-South Korea military exercises. This morning, North Korea fired 2 mid-range missiles in Japan's direction in protest for trilateral talks that were held between the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. These types of provocations are completely unacceptable and threaten to destabilize the region. As the world's greatest democracy, we must take a tougher stance with our international partners on North Korea's threatening antics and deplorable human rights record. Lastly, I want to highlight the importance of strengthening our partnership and our relationship with South Korea. In 2013, South Korea was the United States' 6th largest trading partner. According to the California Chamber of Commerce, California is Korea's 5th largest export destination, and in 2013 exported nearly $8.4 billion of product to South Korea. It's an incredibly important relationship. Korean Americans also have a very deep-seated history and deep-seated roots in my home state of California. The vibrant and thriving Korean community has successfully created 2 of the largest cultural heritage centers outside of Korea in both Los Angeles and Oakland. Deepening our long-standing friendship and cooperative relationship with South Korea is imperative and necessary as we look to stabilize the inter-Korean relationship. I look forward to reviewing our positions, and I remain wholeheartedly committed in supporting a peaceful and prosperous Pacific region. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank you again for calling this crucial hearing, and I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses.
Thank you very much. And now, any other members who would like to make a brief opening statement? I'll recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and let the word go forth that the Congress of the United States understands the monstrous nature of the regime that now controls North Korea. North Korea's military power has been financed by taking food from its people, medicines from its sick, education from its children. They have used that wealth that should have gone to supply just basic needs for their people, and instead used it to subsidize a ghoulish elite that is guilty of monstrous crimes, and to subsidize a military power that would then, of course, be used not only for their country's security against threats from abroad, but also be used against its own people to keep themselves in power. The North Korean horror story is testimony to the failure of a policy that is based on trying to change the behavior of such monstrous gangster regimes by treating them well, or by doing them favors, or trying to figure out a way of being nice to them, thinking that that will change the fundamental nature or in some way affect the decisions of those people who rule with an iron fist. As far as North Korea, Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure if you were here then or not, but I certainly remember a debate in which I sat right over here years ago about whether or not we should be providing North Korea with energy, with oil, and whether we should help feed their population. And of course, for a decade, we provided huge amounts of food and energy for the government of North Korea. And surprise, surprise, it didn't change the nature of that horrible regime. It didn't civilize the leaders of that country whatsoever. And today, we in fact can see no results whatsoever to the hundreds of millions of dollars of humanitarian assistance that we gave to the people of North Korea, yet they are still held in bondage, and their government, it has had no impact on their government policies whatsoever. We need to take this as a lesson, make sure that it guides what our decisions are in the future, which is we should be siding with the oppressed rather than trying to curry favor with the oppressor. And we have not reached out to the people of North Korea in an effort to eliminate that horrible regime that oppresses them so. I look forward to hearing more details about what's happening in North Korea from our witnesses.
Thank you. Mr. Rohrabacher, by the way, is the chairman of the Europe, Eurasia, and Emerging Threats Subcommittee. And I'd now like to recognize another gentleman from California. Got a lot of Californians here this afternoon. Brad Sherman, who is the ranking member of the Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade Subcommittee. Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, it was good to be with you, the chairman of the full committee, and others on our trip to Asia last month, where we had a chance to meet with President Park to view the DMZ and even a few soldiers of the North Korean military. And one thing that's striking, because I think it's the only place in the world where this is true, land is considerably cheaper in northern Seoul than southern Seoul, simply because in northern Seoul you're under the gun of more than tens of thousands of artillery pieces north of the DMZ. I think Seoul is the only great city in the world where you have a national security reason for land to be cheaper on one side of town than the other side of town. The gentleman from California makes a point about our aid. I would say that were there to be a curtailment and rollback of the nuclear program of North Korea, that might not help the people of North Korea, but it would make this a safer planet. And I would differ with him under those circumstances which do not exist, and therefore don't differ with him. I've served on this committee for about 18 years. We've heard every possible description of cruelty. But this is a nationwide gulag. This isn't some people being oppressed. This is virtually everyone. And this will go down in history as one of the cruelest regimes in the world, certainly the cruelest in Korean history. We should keep in mind that this regime survives only because of the subsidy it receives from China. And a trade policy that allows China to sell $300 billion more in the United States than we sell there, empowers Beijing, and Beijing doesn't always use that power for good. Kim Jong-un has simply added an element of immaturity and mercurial unpredictability and instability to what was already a cruel regime. And finally, we should never hesitate to call on Japan and especially South Korea to spend more on its military. We, who are blessed to be behind oceans and are not on the front lines, spend over 5% of our GDP on our military, if you include veterans' benefits, as I do, whereas South Korea spends roughly 2.7%, Japan slightly less than 1%. And those who are on the front lines, who face the greatest threat, should be willing to spend as much of their treasure as we do. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I'd this time like to introduce our distinguished panel. We begin with Grace Yo, who was born in North Korea, a place where she almost starved to death as a child. In 2006, Ms. Yo and two of her family members escaped North Korea. Soon after, she and her family were rescued by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which enabled them to enter the U.S. as legal refugees. Grace is one of 170 refugees from North Korea who have settled in the U.S. She became a U.S. citizen last year, and we congratulate you for that and welcome you, and lives outside of Washington, D.C. She and her family have actively protested the forced repatriation of North Korean escapees hiding out in China. In addition to being a human rights activist, she dreams of going to law school to study international law for the purpose of helping North Korean defectors. Ms. Yo works as a dental certified assistant in the United Dental Group to earn a living. She attends classes in the evening to reach her academic goals. She also volunteers for her sister's nonprofit organization, North Korea in USA, which helps North Korean refugees in the United States and China. And we welcome you here, as I mentioned. I'd next like to introduce Greg Scarlato. Am I saying that correctly? Thank you. Mr. Scarlato is the Executive Director for the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, HRNK, where he handles outreach programs aiming to focus world attention on human rights abuses in North Korea. Prior to joining HRNK, he was the Director of Public Affairs and Business Issues of the Korea Economic Institute. He has also served as Management Associate for the International Science and Technology Institute in Arlington, Virginia. He previously lived in Seoul for 10 years and is fluent in Korean, French, and Romanian. He has also authored a weekly radio column broadcast by Radio Free Asia to North Korea. Mr. Scarlato holds Masters in International Relations from Tufts University, Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and Seoul National University, and a BA in International Relations from Seoul National University. Mr. Scarlato was conferred the title of Citizen of Honor, City of Seoul, and is also a member of the Board of Directors for the International Council on Korean Studies, and we welcome you also here this afternoon. And we also have Bruce Klingner, who who is the Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center. Previously, he served as the CIA's Deputy Division Chief for Korea, where he provided analysis on political, military, economic, and leadership issues for the President of the United States and other senior U.S. policymakers. He was the chief of CIA's Korea branch, which analyzed military developments during a nuclear crisis with North Korea. Mr. Klingner is a distinguished graduate of the National War College, where he received a master's degree in national security strategy. He also holds a master's degree in strategic intelligence from the Defense Intelligence College and a bachelor's degree in political science from Middlebury College in Vermont. And as I said, we welcome all three witnesses here this afternoon. We have, of course, what you've probably heard referred to as the 5-minute rule. There are lights down there that will let you know when you have 1 minute to go. It'll turn yellow at that point, and when it turns red, we'd ask you that you wrap it up. Your time's kind of up at that point. And we'll also limit ourselves to 5 minutes in asking questions, too. So we'll begin with you this afternoon, Ms. Joe, and you probably need to turn the mic on there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello, my name is Grace Zhou. It's very nice to see everyone here. I was born in 1991 in North Hamgyong Province in North Korea. In 1993, our family started to have a shortage of food. In 1997 to 1998, my family lost my father, maternal grandmother, younger siblings, and big sister. Since I was born, my parents have tried many different ways to raise us. We tried to find sustenance in wild vegetables, grasshoppers, rats, tree barks, and even cattle in government-operated farms. In North Korea, killing a cow is considered a crime comparable to homicide. So a person caught killing a cow could be sentenced to death by shooting. Full aware of these facts, my parents risked their lives in order to feed my family. Our family did everything we could try, but due to the government's prohibition, we could not do any business, and eventually, when my parents ran out of ways to feed our family, they made the hard decision to illegally cross the border to China. In spring 1997, my parents illegally visited a relative in China and purchased some food with their help. However, when they arrived home, my father was arrested by the police, and officials of our hometown came with the clubs and took my mother away after ruthlessly beating her. They also took away all of the food. My grandmother, my younger brother, my older sister, and I all cried as we tried to hold on to the things that they were taking away. In one day, we lost our parents and our food, and our house was in ruins with nothing left for us. Later, we learned afterwards that my father had told the officials about my mother's pregnancy and begged for her release. However, my father admitted all the charges that they were accusing him of, and he was punished. Because he was a man, he had to suffer from all kinds of torture by the police. In the end, while he was being transported to a prison on a train, he passed away, unable to withstand any further. Continuously, many things happened that led us to leave our hometown and escape to China. However, we were deported back to North Korea 4 times. When we were sent back to North Korea, I myself did not receive too many punishments since I was a minor. However, the miseries I saw gripped my heart. When minors are sent back to North Korea, Boibu taken them to orphanages called Guhoso. The first orphanage I was sent to was located in Siniju. Siniju, among the people who were staying at the orphanage, included a 5-week-old infant to an 18-year-old. The directors at the orphanage gave only 40 grams of baby formula per day. 16-year-olds were less than 4 feet tall. There were 2 groups of children at the orphanage. The first group was those few children who had enough strength and toe to go out to the market field and steal food. And there were those who could only stay inside of the orphanage, those who could move, build storage rooms, and did other labor. Inside the orphanage, there were about 10 rooms and 15 to 20 children stayed in each room. The space was so small that everyone had to sleep in the same direction at night. There wasn't enough water, and for food, instead of rice, we were given barley and radish soup. After waking up at 6 each morning, we had to work until 7 p.m. For the smallest instance, the directors would punish us, and because guards stood post every day, we couldn't escape outside the orphanage over the wall. For an example, a 15-year-old who was caught escaping tore his left leg tendon as a result of beating, and there was no one to take care of his condition. Some of these children who were beaten had their food taken away and worked endlessly died because of their weakness. I'm 5 feet 3 inches, but when I was sent back to North Korea in 2006, they used to call me a giant. And one time, I slapped on the face on account of my height. Likewise, many others born in and after the 90s couldn't grow due to malnutrition. Education was available only for those children from families with good backgrounds, with ties to the government, and with ties to communist heroes. Only those from families who did well enough to give money or other goods to the teachers or schools could attend the schools. The studies materials available were in poor quality, such as paper made from tree barks for writing. Lastly, on October 2006, there were 3 boiled potatoes that the orphanage was giving out to the children. Our family, before released, was staying together for 3 days at an orphanage after transported to my hometown. And when we asked the girl who brought the potatoes to us, she said that they had been living on those potatoes for the past 2 weeks. I was well over 10 years old, but North Korea had not changed at all during my lifetime. A country that beats people to death like they are animals for having a religion. A country that sends a family of 3 generations for one family member's travel command. A country that requires a travel permit for someone to attend his or her parents' funeral. In novels, books, biographies, and poems, nothing else can be written but praises of the great leader. It is a country with absolutely no freedom, a country that abuses its senior citizens and mistreats its children, though it labels them as treasures. A country that has beaten its citizens for the past over 20 years, a country in which the soldiers rob the civilians of their food. I believe in the U.S. and the UN, a country and an international body that actually do treat the children as they should be as treasures. I would like to please ask the U.S. and UN to rescue the suffering North Korean people. I would like to please ask you, please remember the Holocaust. At least the survivors have finally found their freedom and may live freely as all of you do. However, the people in North Korea have been living under tyranny over the past several decades, and even right now, as the people suffered under the Nazi regime, please be their voice and be advocates of their human rights. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Mr. Scarlato, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
On behalf of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, I would like to express great appreciation to Chairman Steve Chabot and the distinguished members of the subcommittee for holding this hearing today to highlight the human rights situation in North Korea and for inviting me to testify. Mr. Chairman, in today's oral testimony, I will be summarizing my written statement. 120,000 men, women, and children, those suspected of being disloyal to the Kim regime and up to 3 generations of their families, continue to be brutally persecuted behind the barbed wire fences of North Korea's political prison camps. The people of North Korea continue to be divided into 3 social categories and 51 subcategories based on their loyalty to the regime. In the mid to late 1990s, as up to 3 million North Koreans starved to death, the Kim regime continued to invest in the development of its ballistic missile and nuclear weapons program. The human rights situation has deteriorated under the Kim Jong-un regime. 3 trends stand out in particular: an aggressive crackdown on attempted defections, a forceful purge of former officials, and the restructuring of North Korea's political prison camp system. Facilities near the border with China have been closed, while other camps have been expanded. The UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in North Korea, established by consensus by all 47 member states of the UN Human Rights Council, found that in many instances the violations identified entailed crimes against humanity based on state policies. Systematic, widespread, and gross human rights violations that have been and are being committed by North Korea involve extermination, murder, enslavement, torture, imprisonment, rape, forced abortions, and sexual violence, persecution on political, religious, racial, and gender grounds, the forcible transfer of populations, the enforced disappearance of persons, and the inhumane act of knowingly causing prolonged starvation. The Commission of Inquiry determined that crimes against humanity target anyone viewed as a threat to the political system and leadership of North Korea, in particular political prisoners, those attempting to defect, religious believers, Christians in particular, people introducing information from the outside world into North Korea, and citizens of other countries abducted by North Korea. The Commission of Inquiry pointed out that since the government of North Korea is not willing to prosecute its own officials, the United Nations will have to protect the population of North Korea and ensure that those most responsible for crimes against humanity are held accountable. The Commission of Inquiry further recommended that the UN Security Council refer the North Korean situation to the International Criminal Court. Furthermore, the inclusion of North Korean human rights in the UN Security Council's permanent agenda would be a long overdue and feasible measure. It is our Committee for Human Rights in North Korea's view that the United States government ought to support greater involvement by UN agencies in North Korea beyond the human rights bodies. UN agencies to which the United States government is a significant contributor, agencies tasked with development or humanitarian assistance, should be fully aware of the findings of the UN Commission of Inquiry and find ways to promote them. U.S.-North Korea policy has been dominated by grave political security concerns. The policy of strategic patience has been one of very few, if any, options within a context defined by the North Korean regime's lack of international credibility and established patterns of deceitful behavior. Nevertheless, crimes against humanity have been and are being committed in North Korea. As the horror of what author Mark Halperin termed as a slow-motion Holocaust continues, the people and government of the United States can unambiguously afford no strategic patience that would allow the Kim regime more time to abuse, starve, wrongfully imprison, maim, torture, and kill the innocent. Human rights concerns must be included in the agenda of future bilateral and multilateral talks with North Korea, should such talks be resumed. The international sanctions regime against North Korea aims to prevent the development and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missile technology by North Korea and is not linked to North Korea's human rights situation. In order to achieve international momentum on a scale comparable to the anti-apartheid campaign of the 1980s, the international sanctions regime must address North Korea's human rights violations. A sanctions regime effectively addressing the North Korean human rights situation must sever access to funds linked to the crimes against humanity and other human rights violations perpetrated by the North Korean regime until the situation has been verifiably remedied. Effective sanctions should also sever the access to luxury goods and foreign travel for those officials most responsible for North Korea's crimes against humanity. Mr. Chairman, the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea considers it essential to bring attention to the systematic, widespread crimes against humanity and egregious human rights violations perpetrated by the North Korean regime, to protect the victims, to bring justice to their tormentors, and, without further delay, to seek ways to improve the human rights situation in that country. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We appreciate your testimony. Mr. Klingler, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the panel. It is truly an honor to be asked to appear before you on such an important issue to our national security. As we've heard from my colleagues, North Korea's crimes against humanity clearly show the regime is a threat to its citizens. North Korea under Kim Jong-un has also demonstrated it is a military threat to U.S. allies in Asia, a worldwide proliferation threat, and increasingly a direct military threat to the United States. It is fitting that today's hearing occurs on the 4-year anniversary of North Korea's sinking of the South Korean naval ship Chonan, a North Korean act of war which resulted in the deaths of 46 South Korean sailors. North Korea has made greater progress than widely perceived, if not already achieved, warhead miniaturization, the ability to place nuclear weapons on its short-range missiles, and a preliminary ability to reach the United States. As such, the United States and its allies face a greater threat today than is widely construed. Despite repeated U.S. attempts at diplomacy, North Korea refuses to abide by the commitments it made during numerous international agreements to give up the nuclear weapons that it had previously agreed never to pursue in the first place. Now, North Korea now demands recognition as a nuclear-armed state. It declared there will be no more discussions over denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and proclaimed only fools will entertain the delusion that we will trade our nuclear deterrent for petty economic aid. Despite initial hopes that the new Chinese leadership would more fully implement UN-required actions against North Korea, Beijing instead continues to be part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Clearly, the United States cannot rely on China to constrain North Korea. President Obama declared that North Korea's nuclear weapons program was a threat to U.S. national security and vowed significant, serious enforcement of sanctions. But despite this, the United States has pursued a policy in which we only incrementally increase punishments on Pyongyang for its repeated defiance of the international community. The United States has pulled its punches when targeting financial measures against North Korea. By contrast, the U.S., EU, and UN have imposed far more pervasive and compelling measures against Iran, even though Pyongyang, not Tehran, has withdrawn from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, tested nuclear weapons, and repeatedly threatened nuclear attacks on the United States and its allies. By adopting a sanctions policy of timid incrementalism, with promises to be tougher the next time that North Korea misbehaves, the U.S. is squandering the opportunity to more effectively impede progress on North Korea's nuclear and missile programs and coerce compliance with UN resolutions. Just as strong measures induced Iran back to the negotiating table, more robust sanctions are needed to leverage North Korea. There's a widespread misperception that North Korea is the most heavily sanctioned country in the world and there's nothing more that can be done. That is simply not true. In my submitted testimony, I've provided an extensive list of additional specific financial measures that the U.S. can and should impose on North Korea, as well as against non-North Korean entities that are violating U.S. law and UN resolutions. Most of these recommended actions have already been applied against other nations, including Iran and Burma. These are targeted financial measures against the regime and other violators, not the North Korean people themselves. In essence, they are financial precision-guided munitions and not economic carpet bombing against the populace. Since it is a unilateral U.S. financial strategy against violators, China cannot veto it, and Beijing will find it harder to block than a diplomatic strategy or traditional trade sanctions. A few of these recommended actions are to designate North Korea as a primary money laundering concern, as the U.S. previously did with Iran and Burma, to ban North Korean financial institutions' correspondent accounts in the United States. Even financial institutions not doing business in the U.S. would be affected, since nearly all dollar-denominated transactions internationally must pass through U.S. Treasury-regulated banks. Publicly identify and sanction all foreign companies, financial institutions, and governments assisting North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. Impose third-party sanctions on entities that trade with those on the sanctions list. Compel the removal of North Korea from the SWIFT financial transfer network, as Iranian banks were in 2012. To formally charge North Korea as a currency counterfeiter. Tighten maritime counterproliferation by targeting shipping companies and airlines caught proliferating. And finally, to enhance U.S. inspections of shipping companies transiting ports that consistently fail to inspect North Korean cargo. In conclusion, the current U.S. policy of strategic patience is predominantly passive because it fails to impose sufficient pressure to effectively degrade North Korea's capabilities or alter its behavior. Minimalist measures have only encouraged North Korea to continue to expand and refine its nuclear arsenal and missiles and emboldened it to proliferate. The U.S. has sufficient tools. It has only lacked the resolve to use them. Finally, I would submit that the operative question should be, why would the United States hesitate to impose the same measures on North Korea that Washington has already implemented on other countries for far less egregious violations? I thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the testimony from all three of the witnesses here this afternoon. And I'd now like to recognize the gentleman from the Commonwealth of Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for the purpose of making an opening statement.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate very much you holding this hearing. Also appreciate the testimony, particularly of Ms. Grace Joe, and just listening to what she went through and her family went through. Thank you so much for the courage of testifying today. I also, Mr. Chairman, delighted that the chairman of the committee has announced that we're going to actually mark up H.R. 1771, North Korea sanctions. And Mr. Klinger, am I pronouncing that right? Thank you for your list. Very helpful, because I think they do need to have teeth. 2 points I would just make, Mr. Chairman, listening to this panel. One is, it is imperative that the United States put teeth into the sanctions it imposes in the North. They should never be less than what they are with some other rogue states. And secondly, we may have an opportunity with respect to China, and I know we're going to explore that on this panel. But the fact of the matter is, when Kim Jong-un executed his uncle, he executed the chief interlocutor with the People's Republic of China. And in doing that, perhaps the Chinese got the message that their longstanding policy with respect to North Korea may no longer be tenable. And that may give us a diplomatic opportunity. And again, I very much look forward to talking to the panel about that. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. And I'll now begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes for the purpose of asking questions. China's policy toward North Korea, and Mr. Connolly already alluded to this, appears to have undergone some evolution in the years since Xi took office. In some instances, appearing to be more willing to express its displeasure with Pyongyang. What, if anything, can be done to influence China, who is, after all, the key here and has the most influence with North Korea, to pressure North Korea, to lean on them, to not civilize itself? That seems to be beyond the capability of this regime, but to at least be less oppressive to its people than it currently is. And I would welcome any of the witnesses to talk to us about that. Mr. Klingner?
Yes, sir. As I said, there were hopes that Xi Jinping would be different. And a year ago, during the time when North Korea was heightening tensions to a dangerous level, it appeared China was more angry with its recalcitrant ally. Since then, since North Korea has shifted back to a charm offensive, we've seen Beijing sort of walk back from those initial positive, hopeful steps. Most recently, we've seen China has rejected the UN Commission of Inquiry's human rights report, saying it's divorced from reality. And they have refused UN action to refer it either to the ICC or a tribunal. We have seen in the past China has turned a blind eye to proliferation that transited its country, North Korean missile parts, for example, going to Iran. We've seen it refused to take actions when even the U.S. government provided information. It did recently take action or sort of severed financial relations with North Korea's financial trade bank. It had done this a decade ago and then undid that action. So there are a number of things China has done but then undid them. So again, I think we need a focus on a unilateral U.S. strategy rather than relying on China in the UN Security Council.
Thank you. Mr. Scalata, did you want to add anything to that?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. China is an aspiring superpower that helped establish and maintain the Kim regime in power for more than 60 years. In a letter addressed to to the President of China, the Commission of Inquiry made it clear that by its policy of forcibly returning North Korean refugees to conditions of danger, China puts itself in a position where it is aiding and abetting a regime that has committed crimes against humanity. Certainly, as Mr. Klingner has pointed out, the recommendation that the Security Council refer the case to the International Criminal Court is unlikely to happen over the short to medium term, in particular because of a potential Chinese veto. For what it's worth, we might as well push the Chinese and place them in a position where they actually have to exercise their right to veto as a permanent member of the Security Council, further reinforcing the clear impression that China is aiding and abetting a regime that has committed crimes against humanity.
Thank you very much. Ms. Yo, if I could turn to you now and ask you a different question. As a refugee yourself, could you share with us kind of your insights about the obstacles that you faced obtaining refugee status in the U.S., and about the humanitarian conditions that North Korean refugees face in general?
Yes, sir. As a refugee, our family had lived in the United States almost 6 years now. And in the beginning, we had a support from the government about 8 months, which is Medicare and food stamps and cash about $250 for each person. So that helps our family a lot. And I believe most of the refugees, they will get same benefits as our family. The one thing I would like to ask government to support refugees, which is North Korean refugees, is we needed some source or organization to support new refugees, to educate them in society. And in America, the language is different and society is different. It's very difficult to simulate in the society as a refugee. So I don't know, is there any organization we can educate them, but I would like to ask government to support some organization to educate them and support them about a year or year and a half to help them to know the United States.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. My time has expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Ms. Joe, thank you for your courage and for telling us your story. And Mr. Klingner, how many nuclear weapons, and I realize this is unclassified and just, does North Korea have, or at least have enough fissile material to create? And can you tell us the status of their uranium and plutonium programs to create additional weapons?
Well, sir, the information on North Korea is very difficult to get. Even when I was in the intelligence community, we referred to it as the hardest of the hard target. But I think experts generally assess that North Korea likely has 6 to 8 plutonium-based nuclear weapons. The uranium program, I believe, is much further along than some believe it has achieved, because it has been underway since the late 1980s. It also received critical support from Pakistan and the AQ-CON network. There's been a rogues gallery of interaction with Iran, Pakistan, AQ-CON, Libya, and North Korea, where they exchanged valuable information and components. So I think in return for North Korean assistance on putting warheads onto short and medium-range missiles to Pakistan, Pakistan replied by providing centrifuges and critical.
So their plutonium program generated enough fissile material from 6 to 8 weapons, and the consensus seems to be that program is not producing any more fissile material?
It has been dormant for some years, but we've seen just in the last year from unclassified satellite imagery that North Korea is expanding its uranium reprocessing facilities, its the reactor program at Yongbyon. as well as two very extensive missile launch facilities on the east and the west coast. So the latest missile test, the latest nuclear test may have been uranium, but we were unable to determine whether it was plutonium or uranium.
I would point out that there's a focus on missiles, even missile defense, and obviously the highest status for dictators to have a nuclear-tipped intercontinental ballistic missile. But the less prestigious way to deliver a nuclear weapon is to smuggle one, and you could easily smuggle one into the United States inside a bale of marijuana. We're not safe from this. We declared that it was unacceptable for North Korea to have a nuclear weapon, and then went to sleep, pretty much. And so we are now in a position where it may be in our interest to negotiate with a terrible regime and to provide the kind of aid that Mr. Rohrabacher would decry if there was a way to limit them to their current 6 to 8 plutonium-based weapons. The only thing worse than a North Korea with 6 to 8 weapons is a North Korea with 16 to 18 weapons. Has the North Korean government shown any interest in even limiting, let alone disgorging, the fruits of its nuclear weapons program, Mr. Cleaner?
No, sir. They've made very clear under Kim Jong-il and now under Kim Jong-un that they have no intention of abandoning their nuclear arsenal. They have repeatedly...
Of abandoning or even failing to augment? Or just they have no intention to abandon or no intention to fail to augment?
Right. They have violated the 4 previous agreements that they signed to never pursue nuclear weapons program. They violated the 3 agreements to denuclearize. They've indicated no indication that they want to pursue that.
So we have no reason not to follow every one of your suggestions as to how to impose additional sanctions.
Well, what I recommend is, as part of a comprehensive integrated strategy, using conditional engagement and also the more effective punitive measures to try to compel them to return to their denuclearization commitments. And then, since perhaps those two
the problem we have on denuclearization is Gaddafi gave up his nuclear program, which was more advanced than we realized. Saddam gave up his weapons of mass destruction. The Ukraine gave up the 3rd largest nuclear arsenal. Gaddafi and Saddam are dead, and Ukraine doesn't have Crimea. It's going to be very hard to convince any country that has nuclear weapons to give them up, given that track record. We may be able, though, to halt progress toward future weapons, whether it be Iran, which is still at 0, or North Korea. But I think the goal of a non-nuclear North Korea is a goal we should have stuck to and didn't. But I thank you for outlining the possible actions we could take to try to create a verifiable destruction of those tools that they are using, particularly in the uranium area, to expand their stockpile of nuclear weapons. And given how this regime treats its own people, it's pretty important to make sure they don't have even more. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Scarlato, what would you characterize as the successes of our policy of strategic patience?
Mr. Perry, certainly in our area of human rights, unfortunately, the greatest challenge that we face is that we have paid a lot of attention to the very important political security challenges that we face on the Korean Peninsula, but not the human rights considerations. I think that we need to take those concerns into account because concern for human rights is part of who we are, because these are values that we share with our friends, partners, and allies in Northeast Asia and beyond, in particular.
So let me pardon my interruption, but let me rephrase it. So are there any successes, strategic, tactical, nuclear, human rights? Are there any successes to this strategy that you can enumerate for me?
As far as I can see, there are no successes, Congressman Perry. As far as I can see, The policy of strategic patience is one of very few, if any, available options that we have under the current circumstances, in particular because North Korea has entirely lost its international credibility, as Mr. Klingner was mentioning, by joining the Non-Proliferation Treaty, pulling out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, joining the Geneva Agreed Framework, pulling out most recently in 2012, agreeing to the Leap Day Agreement in 2.5
Right.
weeks.
I mean, we know that they don't honor any of their commitments. I'm just frustrated, I think, as many Americans are, that what we're doing is just kind of sitting back and waiting to see what happens. Meanwhile, the things that Ms. Joe enumerated are occurring on a minutely, instantaneous basis every hour of the day, and it breaks our heart to know that and know that we're literally doing nothing about it. Let me move on. Mr. Klingner, how do you view the international interim nuclear deal with Iran in relation to the North Korean nuclear problem? Do you see any juxtaposition? Does one have any effect of the other, or does one incentivize North Korea in a certain way or not, or is there any interplay whatsoever in your mind?
Well, in reviewing the interim agreement, I certainly had a case of deja vu, having followed North Korea for 20 years. I think there are lessons that we've learned from negotiating with North Korea that should be applied with Iran. I think we need very extensive, very detailed negotiations or agreements like we had with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. We need very, very stringent verification measures to ensure that North Korea or Iran is not cheating as North Korea repeatedly has done in the past. We need to have the willingness to walk away from the table if it's a bad deal. I think in the past with North Korea, we often saw, as one negotiator put it, the desire to keep the bicycle moving. If it stops, it falls over. So the negotiations were kept going for the sake of keeping them going.
We learned, but in essence, learning is I would think you would take a different action based on what you learned from the mistakes that you learned. But we have the information. We know what was successful. We know what failed, but we haven't applied any of that in Iran, if I could be succinct about your answer.
I think the lessons are there. Whether we've learned them is a different story.
All right. Do you accept the assessment of the U.S. intelligence community that North Korea will be deterred from using nuclear weapons, except possibly in the scenario of imminent regime collapse?
I would largely agree. I think they realize that using nuclear weapons would bring about the end of their regime and the end of their country. I think their nuclear weapons are intended more for compellence or coercion. The U.S. and South Korea have been deterred from responding to military attacks that North Korea has committed in the past, even before they had nuclear weapons. And now that they have nuclear weapons, North Korea would think that they could get away with more than they did before.
Okay, thank you. I will tell you that as other members of the panel listened intently to your list of potential options for the United States, and I'll be working with the chairman and the other members of the committee to help draft that legislation, partly due to the list that you provided, or with that in mind, because I think it'd be very helpful. In the time remaining, Ms. Joe, your story is incredibly compelling, and I can tell you, I think it breaks everyone's heart in the room, and if every American could hear it, would break their heart. But from your point of view, and I understand you've been gone a long time and you were there as a child, but the things you've seen and endured, what, from your perspective, would make a difference to turn that leadership around, to have the people rise up against this depression, to completely change the situation in North Korea? What will motivate? Is there anything that can motivate the people? Is there any chance for the people to do this on their own, and some way for the United States and the United Nations to motivate that, empower that, encourage that?
In politically, I don't have full educated, so I cannot give you the exact answer. But in my opinion, I am thinking in the United States, we can help the ministries or the individual people who already escaped into China, who are seeking freedom. So we can rescue refugees in the China to the freedom country. And once we rescue hundreds, thousands refugees from North Korea, I believe one day North Korean regime will fall down.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your answer. We
you.
appreciate that. Gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Klingler, first of all, it's not often I find myself in near total agreement with the Heritage Foundation, but I must say I found your testimony right on and very helpful in terms of not just providing a critique of U.S. policy, but giving us a roadmap for how we might become much more efficacious. And I thank you for that contribution as well. And I'd echo what my colleague said. I think when I've written the chairman and requesting a markup of H.R. 1771, and we're going to do that. And when we do, we certainly will take a very close, hard look at your recommendation. So this hearing is very timely. Let me ask you about China. How important do you think China is to the ultimate issue of North Korea and ultimate reunification? The conventional wisdom had it that the Chinese would never support reunification, that having the Hermit Kingdom sort of under their thumb served their interests, keeping the peninsula divided served their interests. But you could make the case that perhaps in light of recent events and, frankly, the opening up of the Chinese economy, they have a lot more in common with the South than they do with the North. And that the North has now become an albatross more than anything else. And in this case, even a sort of unpredictable albatross, if such a thing exists. I don't know if albatrosses can be unpredictable, Mr. Chairman, but let's assume they can. Especially in light of the execution of Kim Jong-un's uncle. So how important is China? What leverage do they have? And do we have reason to believe as the United States that they might be more open to our importunings than in the past?
You ask a very good question, sir, because experts on China and North Korea have been struggling with that, and we haven't come to an answer. The Chinese-North Korean relationship is complicated, and what we've seen in China, even at the senior leadership level, is a split between, if you will, old school who support their ally and an alliance forged in blood, and the younger leadership who sees, as you point out, North Korea is an albatross. The future of China on the Korean Peninsula is with the South for economic reasons. So there is that struggle, but to date, the old school has outvoted the new school. As for unification, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and Track 2 discussions outside of government have tried to get China to articulate what are its red lines, what are its thoughts towards unification, would it accept it, what would cause it to go into North Korea. And China has been resistant. So that lack of transparency is very concerning to U.S. and South Korean policymakers. Just yesterday when Xi Jinping met with Park Geun-hye, he seemed to indicate acceptance of unification or support for President Park's unification approach. We don't know how much we can take that to the bank. One would hope China would acquiesce to a Korean unification, but we don't know. And that uncertainty is of great concern to the United States.
What is the remaining leverage Beijing has on Pyongyang?
Although it has the most leverage of any country in the world on North Korea, its amount of leverage is less than perhaps people think. Of course, you can point to the overwhelming majority of economic engagement from North Korea to China. It's its largest trading partner. People say China could cut off the food and the fuel, but China is unlikely to do that. That would create a crisis on the border, which is what they want to avoid. So I think what the U.S. needs to do is point out to China that its refusal or its resistance to putting pressure on North Korea is bringing about the very crisis it doesn't want. It's encouraging North Korea to pursue these nuclear programs and missile programs, to engage in deadly acts of attack on South Korea, which will bring about U.S. and South Korean military responses that Beijing doesn't want. We need to make clear to Beijing that it can act now or it can act later.
One could also say that, I suppose, of the kind of situation Grace Joe described. I mean, returning North Korean refugees who get into China back to the North Korean regime is virtually a death sentence, and certainly a terrible blemish on the Chinese record. And one wonders whether the Chinese think that's continuing that policy makes any sense in light of the brutality and the lack of international acceptance of the North and its behavior by any norms at all.
Right. As my colleagues can address far better, is that forced repatriation is itself in violation of international accords?
Yes, if the chairman would allow Mr. Scarlett to address the questions, and then I will relent.
Sure, the gentleman's time has expired, but Mr. Scalata
I
can
thank the
respond.
chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Connolly. China joined in 1982 the UN Refugee Convention, the 1951 Refugee Convention. Pursuant to that convention, if a person is repatriated and faces conditions of danger, then that person automatically qualifies to be granted access to the process leading to acquiring political refugee status. We have had numerous credible reports of North Koreans who were forcibly returned by China, especially those who came in contact with South Koreans or Christian missionaries along the road of defection, were tortured, beaten, imprisoned in political prison camps. North Korean women who became pregnant with Chinese men along the road of defection were subjected to sexual violence, rape. We had credible reports of infanticide, forced abortions. China continues this policy of forcible repatriation of North Koreans, claiming that they're illegal economic migrants. Last week in Geneva, on the 17th of March, right after the submission and the presentation of the report of the UN Commission of Inquiry by Judge Michael Kirby of Australia, China again stated that these North Korean refugees are not political refugees but illegal economic migrants, which makes absolutely no sense and is a flagrant violation of the 1951 Refugee Convention.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. We'll go into a second round in case any of the members have questions. We're going to have votes here shortly in any event. Just a couple of quick questions. Mr. Scarlato and Mr. Klingler, let me ask you this first question. You both mentioned the need for more effective and targeted sanctions against North Korea that link sanctions to North Korea's human rights abuses, and we've mentioned the legislation that's being contemplated here, H.R. 1771. Could you touch briefly on what in 1771 you like that may actually have some impact? Mr. Scalata.
Chairman Shabbat, the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea recognizes that the North Korea Sanctions Enforcement Act of 2013 addresses not only North Korea's nuclear and missile programs, but also identifies human rights violations as conduct that is subject to sanctions. The Committee for Human Rights in North Korea appreciates that H.R. 1771 also ensures that humanitarian assistance to North Korea is not affected by the sanctions in the spirit of targeted sanctions called for by the recently released report of the UN Commission of Inquiry. We are aware that the revised draft of the legislation actually ensures that funds that would otherwise have been used by the North Korean regime to purchase ski lifts, luxury goods, weapons, and missile components will be used for the purchase of humanitarian supplies, food, and medicine for those who need it most for the North Korean people. It is certainly also important to ensure that humanitarian assistance is adequately monitored and reaches those who need it most, the most vulnerable people of North Korea.
Thank you. Mr. Klingler, did you want to comment on that?
Yes, the H.R. 1771 certainly has an extensive list of actions that I noticed a lot of overlap with my own recommendations. I think notably on the human rights front, I think that is something that has lagged on the North Korean side. Is we've seen legislation against Iranian human rights violations, Syrian, and I think just to go along with sort of my theory of do unto North Korea as we have already done unto other violators of either human rights accords or U.S. law, international law, UN resolutions. So, I think a good starting point is look at the Commission of Inquiry's listing of the many North Korean government entities or organizations that it condemns as being involved in these human rights violations, they should go on a U.S. sanctions list. Not only the organizations themselves, but the individuals who head those organizations. I think that would be a very good starting point.
Thank you. And the same two gentlemen on this one, and my last question I'd like to leave to you, Ms. Joe. How do you assess the impact of foreign radio broadcasts from the U.S., South Korea, into North Korea? There's been some, I think the administration favors increasing them, and there's some question as to how effective they've been. How effective do you think they have been? Is there any way to make radio broadcasts into North Korea more effective? And, well, I guess I could bring you on this too, Ms. Joe. Had you ever heard anything like that? And how old were you when you left, when you got out of North Korea?
The last time I was 16 years old.
Okay. Did you ever hear any radio broadcasts coming in from outside of North Korea that said anything that would let you know what's really happening out there in the rest of the world, or did that ever happen?
When I get the international news or information, is in China. Yeah.
From China. You didn't get anything from U.S. or from South Korea that you're aware of then, I guess?
Before we come to the United States, we only watch the news about America. That's only the information we got from Chinese TV channels.
And that was from Chinese TV channels. Okay,
Yes.
thank you. Okay. Well, I'll turn the question over to you, gentlemen, then.
Mr. Chairman, the company tasked to monitor broadcasting to North Korea, Intermedia, published a couple of years ago, back then Intermedia was tasked to perform this mission, published an excellent report entitled A Quiet Opening. It conducted interviews with North Korean defectors, North Korean escapees. About 1/3, 30% of them stated that they had listened to foreign broadcasting while in North Korea. Foreign broadcasting also includes broadcasting by stations based in South Korea. For the past 10 years, we have seen a constant increase in the percentage of North Korean defectors who stated that they had listened to foreign broadcasting. Certainly, this does not necessarily mean that 1/3 of all people of North Korea listened to foreign broadcasting. These were those who were most likely to actively seek out information from the outside world. But North Korea is a country where radios have been sealed and basically set to one set government frequency. In the aftermath of the Great Famine of the 1990s, small informal markets have developed as a coping mechanism, not as the result of top-down reform, and cheap radios have been available at these open markets, so more North Koreans have had access to radios and to broadcasting stations based here in the United States and also in South Korea.
Thank you. My time's actually expired. Mr. Klingner, did you want to add anything to that on the broadcast into North Korea?
Yes, if I could, sir. I think information is one of the instruments of national power of the United States, along with diplomacy, military, economic, and other means. And getting information into North Korea, I think, is good. It's beneficial. It can have a corrosive effect on the regime. And we can do that through overt and covert means. Overt is exchanges, which are fine. We shouldn't oversell them as a substitute for conditional diplomatic engagement or more effective punitive measures. We also should do it covertly. There's been a great deal of information that's gotten into North Korea through thumb drives, through pamphlets being transported by balloons, people bringing in DVDs and others, and that really shows the people of North Korea the reality of their own regime as well as the reality of the outside world. So I think we should do everything we can to encourage getting information in and out of North Korea through any means possible.
Thank you very much. As I said, my time's expired. We do have votes on the floor, but the gentleman from Virginia is recognized for up to 5 minutes.
I'll just ask one question as a follow-up, if I may, well, actually, two. Mr. Klingner, with respect to the chairman's last question, you had been talking earlier about we ought to do under North Korea what we've been willing to do to Iran. Do you think one of the reasons there's been some reluctance to do that is that one of the differences is Iran is sensitive to the impact of sanctions on its own population, whereas North Korea seems to be utterly insensitive to the impact of sanctions or any other economic consequences and is willing to have some percentage of its own population starve to death or suffer severe malnutrition rather than to bend the knee or relent. You think that may be one of the concerns the West has, that we, in inflicting punishment on the regime, we're in fact directly inflicting punishment on innocent civilians?
Actually, I think the reluctance to impose greater punitive measures on North Korea really is counterintuitive. As I said before, North Korea has withdrawn from the NPT. It's exploded nuclear devices. It says blatantly its nuclear program is for military purposes, and it also doesn't have a valuable commodity, oil, like Iran does. One would think there would be far greater sanctions on North Korea than Iran, but it's the opposite. I think it's also useful to point out, though.
But I guess what I'm getting at is, why do you think that is so? And I'm offering you perhaps one theory for why it may be so, which in a strange way is a humanitarian reason.
But actually, the targeted financial measures are not would not impact the populace. They are not trade sanctions. They are not general sanctions. They are going after very specific financial links of the regime and other violators to the outside world. So, I think the reluctance really is puzzling, not only to experts on North Korea, but particularly South Korean citizens who can't understand why the U.S. and the international community has been more reluctant to impose these things on North Korea. So, it's targeted financial measures that we want, not broad sanctions that would impact the populace.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Mr. Scarlatti.
Scarlatti, yes, sir.
Can you just briefly bring us up to date on one of the more bizarre practices of the North, and that is this whole phenomenon of abductees?
Yes,
it sounds to the uninitiated almost like a science fiction UFO kind of thing, abductees, but in fact, it's real.
Congressman Connolly, thank you for the question. Our organization, the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, produced the only extensive English language report on this topic, published 3 years ago, entitled Taken. 180,000 citizens of South Korea and other countries, including Japan and others, have been taken by the North Koreans, beginning on the 25th of June, 1950, when the North Korean military attacked South Korea. The practice goes back to a decree by Kim Il-sung. They initially intended to bring over the best and the brightest from South Korea to set up a new society. Most of them ended up in political prison camps. Ethnic Koreans from Japan who decided to return to North Korea or a push to return at the time were never allowed to leave. Their Japanese spouses were not allowed to leave. There have also been foreign nationals of countries, including even, for example, Romania, a former communist ally of North Korea, who were taken, who were abducted by North Korean agents. They were forced to teach foreign languages and cultures to North Korean intelligence operatives. Their identities were used in North Korea's covert operations. And as I'm sure you recall, Congressman Connolly, in 1987, 2 North Korean agents bombed Korean Air Flight 858 1 year before the Seoul Olympics. The 2 North Korean agents who bombed the plane posed as Japanese nationals. One of them, a woman, survived, sentenced to death. She survived. Her sentence was commuted, married her bodyguard, became a star in South Korea, and told the story of how some of the Japanese abductees had provided training while she was in spy school.
It's an unbelievable story, and it deserves much more attention. Thank you for doing the only English report on this terrible practice. And again, thank you to all of the panel for being with us today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Gentleman's time's expired, and I also want to reiterate what the gentleman just said. I think it's been an excellent panel. We especially thank you, Ms. Joe, for having gone through this personally and the trauma that you've suffered during the course of your life. And thank you, gentlemen, for devoting your lives to a critically important issue here. And so we appreciate it very much. And members will have 5 days to submit questions or to revise and extend any of their remarks. And if there's no further business to come before the committee, we're adjourned. Thank you very much.